On Tuesday, a federal judge blocked the Trump administration from using the National Guard here in California. The judge ruled the deployment violated a law limiting military involvement in domestic enforcement.
That's right. Back in June, troops were sent to L.A. during protests against immigration raids. We are joined by constitutional law expert Robert McWhirter for a look at what this means and what's ahead. Robert, thank you so much for being back with us.
Good morning.
Good morning. Okay, so let's first start with this ruling. Break it down for us and talk about why it's significant for Los Angeles.
Well, what the judge said is that the Trump administration's claims that these were just soldiers protecting federal facilities wasn't accurate, that in actuality they were engaged in actual law enforcement activities. And now Trump's lawyers went to court and said, no, they weren't doing that. But Donald Trump himself said that's what they were doing. And that indeed was what they were doing. They were engaged in police activities, law enforcement activities. And according to a law called the Posse Comitatus Act from 1878, it says that federal troops can't do that. And to give some context to this in the Constitution, the framers of our Constitution separated power between the three different branches, but they also separated power between the federal government and the state governments. And the idea of all of that was to protect individual liberties. So you don't want the federal government, especially just one president, coming in and usurping the power of states, the sovereignty of states in these situations, by engaging and using the military and police action. And the Posse Comitatus Act was supported and passed when we brought the southern states back in after the Civil War, and they wanted to take out federal troops out of the South. And so this is where this act came about as a protection for that structure that the framers of our Constitution created. And what the judge said here is, you're violating the act and you're violating this role that should be a state power, which is we are policed by the states.
So there's a lot of little nuance here, though, too, right? The judge didn't say that the troops needed to withdraw now. And you're looking at places like Chicago, where it seems more and more likely, based on the president and some of the speeches he's made recently, that he'll be sending National Guard troops into the city of Chicago. So does this limit what those troops can and can't do if they're deployed? Does this just pertain to California? How does this work?
Well, it does limit what they can do in California, but it doesn't. For instance, a federal judge can't just order the federal government to take troops away. It can order what they do and not do a state function. Now, what President Trump is doing is saying he's going to move into California. This order doesn't affect, rather Chicago, this order doesn't affect what he does in another state. It only affects this jurisdiction.
Gotcha.
Because remember, the Supreme Court said that they can't issue nationwide injunctions anymore. But the judge's ruling here is going to be very influential on a judge in a federal judge in of course Chicago. And really what underscores kind of the hypocrisy of the Trump regime is there are plenty of other cities controlled by Republican mayors and governors that have far higher crime rates than Los Angeles or Chicago. And yet it's just clearly a way to attack a state with a Democratic governor and a Democratic mayor, which is exactly what happened in Los Angeles, and now he wants to do the same thing in Chicago. So the political issues of this are just blatantly ugly and really with no constitutional basis.
Yeah, and we talk about these conversations here in Los Angeles. Of course, you mentioned Chicago, and then Washington, D.C., of course, has been part of the conversation as well. What could this ruling mean for them in the future? Of course, it doesn't directly impact D.C. either.
No. The trouble that people in D.C. have is D.C. is ultimately controlled by the federal government. Now, there's the Home Rule Act that passed in the 1970s, and Congress would have to repeal that act, but the president actually directly controls the National Guard as it relates to Washington, D.C., which, of course, if you wanted to deploy the National Guard, the question there is, well, why didn't you do it on January 6th during the attempted overthrow of the American government? But, and so that begs the question, but the president does have more power in D.C., which is why he tried to do it there before he wants to try to launch it in places like Chicago. So we haven't seen this kind of stuff going on since, quite frankly, the 1860s and the Civil War.
Yeah, it's been a minute. The Trump administration, though, is saying it plans to appeal, which I think we all kind of saw coming. What does that process look like?
Well, that process is going to depend, first of all, on the timetables of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, at least for the L.A. decision. Now, this is Judge Breyer, who's the younger brother of former Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer. Now, then it will go to the Supreme Court. What the Supreme Court has done in many of these cases is not exactly given Trump the win that he says he gets. What it's done is just kind of put the ruling on hold, and the judge put the ruling on hold here as well until it goes to the Supreme Court to hear. Well, then it goes to the Supreme Court, and you have justices there that are very much kind of into this idea of state sovereignty or state authorities and all these kind of ideas, but they're also very conservative and seem to be very pro-Donald Trump. So their own ideologies butting up against themselves with some of these justices on these issues. So I'm very curious to see what they're going to do. I mean, they usually say, hey, you know, the plain text of the Constitution and statutes and the Posse Comitatus Act. The question is, what would these same essentially pro-Trump conservative judges have done if this would have been a president like Joe Biden or Barack Obama? They were pretty good about limiting his presidential powers or their presidential powers. But when it comes to Donald Trump, they don't seem to be very consistent.
Yeah, you always got to think about how partisan politics is playing into all of this. Robert McWhirter, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.